Have you ever wondered why the very first man to die for American freedom is barely mentioned in history books? Why the story of Crispus Attucks, a man of both African and native descent, is often reduced to a single line in classrooms, if it's told at all? And have you ever asked yourself why we rarely, if ever, learn about the hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of other black men and women who sacrificed, who fought, who wrote, who spied, and who resisted during the American Revolution, only for their names to be erased from the nation's founding story? The Revolution is presented as a fight for liberty, but liberty for whom? What truths were left out in order to create a cleaner, simpler national myth? Tonight, we step into the silences of history to uncover the hidden story of Crispus Attucks, the first martyr of the Revolution, and of the many forgotten black heroes who shaped America's birth. Their lives reveal a revolution far more complex, far more human, and far more tragic than the textbooks allow. Let's travel back to Boston, March 5th, 1770. The city is on edge. British soldiers have been stationed there since 1768, sent to enforce unpopular taxes and remind the colonists of imperial authority. Their presence feels like an occupying army, their redcoats a constant provocation. The streets buzz with resentment, taverns hum with angry talk. Dock workers and sailors, already hard lives pressed even harder by competition with British troops who take local jobs, are spoiling for confrontation. That night the weather is bitter cold, the streets coated in slush and ice. Outside the customs house on King Street, a crowd gathers, jeering at a lone sentry. They throw snowballs, some packed with ice and rocks, shouting insults meant to humiliate. Reinforcements arrive, 7 more soldiers with muskets drawn, bayonets gleaming in the lamplight. The crowd swells, now dozens strong. The air crackles with tension. And at the front of that crowd stands a man taller than most, shoulders broad, his presence commanding. Crispus Attucks. Witnesses later described him as the one who pushed forward, wielding a stick, shouting for the crowd to stand firm. Some claimed he struck at the soldiers' muskets, others said he dared them to fire. What we know for certain is that he was there at the very front, leading by sheer force of will. Then chaos. A musket goes off, perhaps accidental, perhaps fired in panic. The rest follow in a deafening volley. Smoke fills the street, screams pierce the night. When it clears, 5 men lie dead or dying. Crispus Attucks is among them. 2 bullets strike his chest. He collapses instantly, his blood spilling into the snow. The crowd scatters in horror. What happened that night will be remembered as the Boston Massacre, a spark that lit the fuse of revolution. But here is the mystery. Attucks was the first to fall, the very first casualty in a struggle that would claim thousands of lives. Why then is his story not etched into the national memory? Why is the name of this man, the first martyr of American liberty, not spoken alongside Washington, Jefferson, and Adams? The answer lies not only in his death, but in his life. To understand Crispus Attucks, we must look beyond the massacre. He was born around 1723, his exact birthplace uncertain, but likely in Framingham, Massachusetts. His mother was a Native American woman, possibly from the Natick or Wampanoag people, survivors of wars and displacements that had devastated New England's original inhabitants. His father was of African descent, almost certainly enslaved. Crispus inherited the condition of bondage, for in colonial America, the child of an enslaved man or woman was enslaved as well. The earliest detailed record of him is not a birth certificate or a church record, but a wanted ad. In 1750, a newspaper carried a notice describing a runaway slave named Crispus also called Michael, who had fled from his master, William Brown. The ad was vivid: 6 feet 2 inches tall, strong, broad-shouldered, with short curly hair. He carried a heavy build, the kind of physique suited for the grueling labor of docks and ships. The notice warned ship captains not to harbor him, for he was determined to live free. And then, silence. For nearly 20 years, the historical record goes quiet. Where was he? Most scholars believe he became a sailor, moving in and out of Boston, working on whaling ships that ventured far into dangerous northern waters, or merchant vessels that crossed the Atlantic. Sailors of color were not unusual in this period. Ships' crews were often diverse, and while prejudice persisted, the life of a sailor offered more independence than plantation fields or city servitude. Attucks may have fought storms, hunted whales, and traveled widely, but what is clear is that by 1770 he was back in Boston, working as a rope maker and dockhand. These jobs placed him in constant conflict with British soldiers who competed for day labor wages and clashed with locals in taverns and on the waterfront. Attucks's entire life had been shaped by the tension between bondage and freedom. Born into slavery, he had stolen his own liberty, forged a living at sea, and now stood in a city simmering with rebellion. So when the night of March 5th came, his presence at the front of that crowd was no accident. He had lived both the weight of chains and the taste of independence. He knew, more than most, what liberty truly meant. In the days that followed the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks's body was not hidden away. It was honored. His coffin, along with those of 4 other victims, was carried in a massive funeral procession through the streets. Thousands of Bostonians joined, mourning not just men, but symbols of resistance. Newspapers across the colonies described the massacre as proof of British brutality. Patriot leaders, eager to stir outrage, seized on the event as a rallying cry. For a brief moment, Attucks was the face of colonial suffering, the very first martyr of the cause. But soon, the narrative began to shift. For some, Attucks's race was a problem. A man of African and native heritage did not fit neatly into the story of liberty the Patriot elite wanted to tell. Some witnesses even blamed Attucks for the violence, calling him reckless, a rabble-rouser, suggesting that his boldness had provoked the soldiers. John Adams, who defended the soldiers in court, went so far as to describe Attucks as having behaved with mad behavior and being at the head of the mob. This was a convenient move. By painting Attucks as unruly, the defense could argue the soldiers fired in panic rather than malice. Yet this legal maneuver also planted seeds of doubt about Attucks's heroism. As the revolution unfolded, and later as the new United States struggled to define itself, Attucks's place in the story grew more uncomfortable. How could a nation founded on liberty and equality acknowledge that its first martyr was a black man, especially when slavery remained legal in half the country and racism was deeply embedded in its culture? And so Attucks's legacy dimmed. Abolitionists in the 1800s resurrected his name, celebrating him as proof that African Americans had been part of America's struggle from the very beginning. But mainstream history pushed him aside, favoring a narrative centered on white founding fathers. The silencing of Attucks is not accidental. It reflects the deeper silencing of thousands of others, like him, men and women whose contributions threatened to expose the contradictions of the revolution itself. Crispus Attucks was only the beginning. When the revolution erupted in 1775, black men were among the very first to answer the call. In Massachusetts, where slavery was already on shaky ground, many free black men joined the militias. At Lexington Green, the morning the shot heard round the world was fired, Prince Estabrook stood shoulder to shoulder with white farmers, and when British muskets roared, he was among the first wounded. His blood mixed with theirs, proof that the struggle for independence was shared. Then came Bunker Hill, where two black men, Peter Salem and Salem Poor, distinguished themselves. Peter Salem, once enslaved, fought with the militia and is widely credited with shooting Major John Pitcairn as he rallied British troops, a moment that turned the tide of the battle. Salem Poor fought so bravely that officers petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to recognize his heroism, calling him a brave and gallant soldier. Yet neither man is celebrated in the pantheon of American heroes. As the war spread, black soldiers served in integrated regiments in the North and segregated units in some colonies. They fought at Trenton, Saratoga, and Yorktown. In the Navy, where experience at sea was highly valued, black sailors made up a significant portion of the crews. Records suggest that at certain points, 1 in 10 soldiers in the Continental Army was black. These men fought not just for independence, but for the hope, often false, that their service would bring them freedom. Some enslaved men were promised emancipation in exchange for enlistment, though many of those promises were broken. Black veterans returned to find themselves re-enslaved or denied pensions. And yet, they fought. They endured the same hunger, cold, and danger as their white comrades. They held the line in battle after battle. Their courage was undeniable, but their memory was erased because their presence revealed too much. It showed that the revolution was not a purely white struggle, that liberty was demanded by all, and that the new nation had betrayed many of its own defenders. For black men and women in colonial America, the revolution was not just a choice between Britain and the colonies, it was a gamble with their very lives. The Patriots spoke of liberty and rights, but rarely extended those ideals to people of African descent. The British, however, saw opportunity. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation. Any enslaved man who escaped his rebel master and joined the king's forces would be granted freedom. Thousands fled plantations, risking capture and death to take up the offer. These men became known as Black Loyalists. Some fought in British units like Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, their uniforms emblazoned with the words, "Liberty to slaves." Others served as laborers, guides, or spies. Women escaped too, carrying children or braving the unknown alone. For them, loyalty to Britain was less about politics and more about survival and hope. When the war ended, thousands of black loyalists were evacuated with the British Army. Some were sent to Nova Scotia, where they endured harsh winters and broken promises of land. Others were resettled in Sierra Leone, beginning new lives in Africa. For many, freedom remained precarious, but it was still more than what the Patriots had offered. Meanwhile, black patriots who had served in the Continental Army faced betrayal of their own. Some were returned to slavery by their masters. Others struggled to claim pensions and recognition. A few found liberty, but their contributions were soon forgotten in the narrative of America's founding. The Revolution, then, was not a straightforward struggle for freedom. It was a complex and often bitter experience for Black Americans, who were forced to choose between two sides, neither of which fully recognized their humanity. Their sacrifices exposed the Revolution not as a perfect moment of liberty, but as a stage on which the fight for Black freedom was only just beginning. Beyond the battlefield, Black men and women shaped the Revolution in profound ways that rarely make it into textbooks. Phillis Wheatley, an enslaved woman in Boston, became the first African-American poet published in the colonies. She used her pen to challenge the hypocrisy of the Patriots, writing verses that celebrated liberty while quietly indicting a society that denied her own. She even corresponded with George Washington, who praised her talent. Her existence itself was a rebuke to those who claimed people of African descent lacked intellect or culture. Then there was James Armistead, later known as James Armistead Lafayette, an enslaved man who became a spy for the Patriots. Pretending loyalty to the British, he infiltrated General Cornwallis's camp and passed along crucial intelligence. His reports misled the British while keeping Washington and Lafayette informed, playing a decisive role in the American victory at Yorktown. For his service, Armistead eventually gained his freedom, but only after years of petitioning. Countless other names have been lost. Black women cooked for soldiers, mended clothing, nursed the wounded, and passed information across enemy lines. Some disguised themselves as men to fight. Children carried messages through hostile territory. Entire communities bore the costs of war without recognition. Their labor, courage, and sacrifice sustained the revolution as much as muskets and cannons did. But when the new nation told its story, they were written out. The deliberate erasure of these figures wasn't just an oversight. It was an act of control, a way to craft a founding myth that left whiteness at the center. Yet their legacies remain, waiting to be remembered, waiting to challenge the story we've been told about America's birth. And so, we return to Crispus Attucks, the man whose life and death embody the contradictions of America's founding. He was born enslaved, he seized his freedom, and he died on the front lines of resistance. He was hailed as a martyr in his own time, then diminished when his story became inconvenient. He stands as a reminder that America's struggle for liberty was never pure, never simple, and never free of hypocrisy. Attucks is not just a figure of the past, he is a mirror held up to the present. He forces us to ask, how can a nation built on his sacrifice and on the sacrifices of thousands like him still struggle to recognize their humanity? What does it mean that the first blood spilled for American independence was black and native, and yet the nation that rose from that blood would spend centuries denying people of African and native descent their rights? His story reveals that the revolution was never just about freedom from Britain. It was also about defining who belonged in the new republic. Crispus Attucks, Peter Salem, Salem Poor, Prince Estabrook, James Armistead Lafayette, Phillis Wheatley, and so many others remind us that liberty was claimed by all, even if it was granted to few. Remembering them is itself an act of resistance, a way of completing the revolution they began. So what does it mean for us today? Perhaps the revolution is still unfolding, not on battlefields, but in classrooms, in communities, and in the stories we choose to tell. Perhaps the true victory will come when the full history of America is acknowledged, not just the comfortable myths, but the difficult truths. And maybe, in remembering Crispus Attucks, we honor not only the man, but the unfinished struggle for freedom he represents. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.